This week on Life and Faith.
At any one time, I think people don't experience the world as being peaceful, but rather actually as kind of filled with evil.
When you trust that another person is doing their best, you're going to give them the benefit of the doubt.
None of us can guarantee staying somewhere forever.
Cognitive ability became what I call the gold standard of human esteem.
If I try being normal, what is it like?
Welcome to Life and Faith from CPX. I'm Simon Smart. We're coming up to Christmas, and that means different things to different people. But at its best, it can mean family, celebration, food, and joy. The trappings reflecting the hope of the season and the Christmas story. And I love this season of holidays and friends and relaxation. This particular year, though, we recall that it was 20 years ago that while many of us in Australia settled into our Boxing Day routines, the post-Christmas fog, beach, backyard cricket, leftover food and sleep-ins, our neighbours to the north of Australia were hit by the devastation of the Boxing Day tsunami. It wreaked havoc across Asia, killing hundreds of thousands of people, and it was a truly shocking event. We're going to remember it today, speaking with our CPX colleague Tim Costello, who at the time was the CEO of World Vision Australia. Now, Tim was on the ground in Sri Lanka within 24 hours of the wave arriving there. And his was a very personal experience of an event that did touch Australians. The scale and the proximity of the disaster meant millions of Australians responded with huge generosity. So, a question for us today. What does the Christmas message and promise of peace on earth mean in the face of human suffering, natural disasters and other heartbreaks that are part of all our lives? Later we'll hear from former CPX-er Mark Stephens and what he makes of peace on earth. But first up, Tim Costello casts his mind back 20 years to that day of such immense loss. Tim, welcome back to Life and Faith. Haven't had you on for a while. Good to see you.
Great to be here.
Now, I want to take you back to Boxing Day 2004. Now, I have to say, Tim, this is one of my favourite days of the year, Boxing Day. Summer holidays stretching out before you and Christmas has been on. I always love Christmas too. And it's surf, sleep, backyard cricket, holiday, festival kind of time. And of course, watching the Boxing Day test in my case. Now, 2004, what's that looking like for you on that day?
Well, that morning I made my way into the MCG for the Boxing Day test. And I started getting phone calls. There's been something that's happened up in Southeast Asia. There's reported, hundreds dead. Within an hour, the hundreds had doubled. They kept doubling the numbers of deaths for the next 3 days. Every hour, thousands dead. I made some calls from the Boxing Day test, left the ground, and by that night was on a plane to Sri Lanka, where the tsunami had hit. I arrived early hours of the morning in Colombo, went to the World Vision office and began what was just a gut-wrenching experience of responding to that wave of death.
As you boarded the plane that evening, can you think back to what you were imagining you might encounter in the place you were heading?
I didn't know. I'd been to a couple of disasters before, in Sudan, the Janjaweed, terrible human evil. Janjaweed, a sort of Arab tribesman militia killing black Sudanese, and they had fled into massive camps. So I had been exposed, I just started at World Vision, to human evil. This was my first natural evil disaster. It was a wave, and it came out of nowhere, and people who trusted the sea and made their living from it suddenly had the sea snatch their loved ones from them. So this was a totally different disaster. The chaos in Colombo was extraordinary, and I started going, this is big. The trip down to Gaul, which was sort of the epicentre, Gaul, which interestingly is the cricket ground where Shane Warne took his 500th wicket. So I knew Gaul for cricketing reasons. Yeah. That trip should take 4 hours. That trip took 13 hours.
Yeah. Because
Colombo residents, in responding, and packed cars just hit the road. And on the way, the train that runs a beautiful scenic along the coastline, Colombo to Gaul, was lying on its side. 1,500 died just trapped in that train when the wave hit. Mm. So that 13 hours was just gut-wrenching, going, so many people staring out to sea, longing that maybe their loved one still had survived. Eerie silence. When I got to Gaul, World Vision with others, doctors were burying bodies in mass graves, mainly women and children because they couldn't run as fast or hold onto a tree. Right. Unnamed, unclaimed in death. Mass graves because of the fear that cholera would break out, which would kill far more. Hmm. And no one prepared me for the stench of bodies. It's a hot, humid climate anyway. The sight was horrible, but the stench is something that I will never forget.
Tell us about the scale of the destruction, which I think is shocking, isn't it?
So 7 different countries affected, 300,000 lives lost from a wave. And Australians were on holiday, like you just described, and just transfixed, particularly because Australian tourists in Thailand died. Trent Broadbridge, a AFL Melbourne footballer, died. And I remember, ringing home and my kids who are young going, "Dad, this is really serious. Trent Broadbridge has died."
Yeah, right. So
if an AFL footballer can die, and Australians were transfixed because we're a nation that lives by the sea. Mm. And if a destructive wave hit us, most of our population are in great cities. If they hit Sydney or Melbourne, what could it do? This had happened to 7 nations, 300,000 people dead, not to mention just the extraordinary power of it. Later when I got up to Banda Aceh, so I went from Sri Lanka to Banda Aceh. Banda Aceh was probably the epicentre, but because of a civil war going on there, the Indonesian government didn't let out the news for 4 or 5 days about how bad that was. Yeah. And when I got up there, massive ships that were a kilometre inland. When I flew in a helicopter up in Banda Aceh for World Vision to survey the damage, the coastline actually reshaped because of the force of the wave. I had never seen anything like it.
What was the hope of World Vision there? Like, what were they doing? What was the plan at that point in terms of trying to help?
So World Vision Sri Lanka had a warehouse. It was, let's get food stocks, let's get water supplies down there. Then same in Indonesia, World Vision Indonesia, when the Indonesian government finally allowed the world to know how bad it was and that they needed extra help. World Vision saying with all the other agencies, and this is what happens, coordinated by the United Nations, it's called OCHA, the Office for Coordination for Humanitarian Affairs, right? World Vision, you're in charge of water and getting water supply in. Oxfam, you're in charge of housing. You're in charge of protecting kids. So many kids have lost parents, and in disasters, sad to say about human nature, children are at risk from others. Yeah. The trouble with the plan was that so many Australian charities, many of whom have never worked outside Australia, also jumped on planes and went up there. That actually, though they meant well, only caused chaos and clogged up the roads. And post this disaster, the United Nations actually said, unless you are certified with humanitarian capability, you can't come and help because it just slowed everything down. It was chaos in these places.
Now, you're there in a professional capacity representing World Vision and then working out what has to happen. But how did that experience impact you personally?
Oh, it was apocalyptic scenes. And I remember not having the time when I was there in the field to ask why, but when I came back, and particularly from Australians, there was pieces in the press, well, the Reverend Tim Costello's up there, why didn't his God stop the wave?
Yeah.
How can he still believe? And I remember responding in pieces in what was then Fairfax, now 9 papers, saying, context determines the questions you ask. In self-sufficient Australia with great emergency systems, we feel quite protected and we have the luxury of asking the question, why didn't God stop this? Where is God? When you're in the context of Sri Lanka or Bande Aceh, people who are devastated, who don't have all those emergency support structures and are overwhelmed, don't have the luxury of that question. The only resource they have is their faith. That's the only resource they have. The question for them isn't, where is God? How could God allow this? But without God, how can I actually face tomorrow, bury my loved ones, find the strength to rebuild my house, to rebuild my life? Context totally determines the question. And I remember responding to those questions in that way.
Yeah. Did you find yourself similarly appealing for help from God rather than question his existence or goodness?
And World Vision, Christian faith organisation, shared that response. Rather than anger, shaking fists at God, a philosophical question from the luxury of my home in Melbourne, we responding out of faith because God is here. God wants the world to flourish, I believe. God willed the world into existence, that God wants humans to flourish, that humans are needy, but God actually wants relationship with them. And faith, therefore, gives you resources and energy and commitment to do things that otherwise you would just say, it's too much. We give up. We check out.
What was the reaction here in Australia to the disaster, broadly speaking?
Well, the reaction was extraordinary. We had a Sydney Opera House concert with all commercial channels raising money for World Vision that raised tens and tens of millions of dollars. Adam Gilchrist, who was playing for Australia at that stage, a World Vision ambassador, organised Australia versus the rest of the world cricket match within 4 weeks. A test normally takes 2 years to organise. And I spoke at that. We raised about, I forget the sum, $15 million. And I addressed the crowd then and said there was a wave of destruction, but coming from Australia was a wave of compassion and generosity. A year on from the Boxing Day test, so Boxing Day 2005, in the lunch break on the first day I addressed the whole crowd. There would have been 80,000, 90,000 people there, thanking them for their generosity and for magnificent leadership from people like Adam Gilchrist.
Was that encouraging to you, that response?
Enormously. Look, to put it in perspective, and not downplaying the generosity, but a generous response is always greater when there have been Australian deaths.
Right.
6 months later, there was a massive earthquake in northwest Pakistan, the sort of area Osama bin Laden was refuted to be in, which I responded to, went there 6 months later, but it was virtually impossible to raise many dollars. Australians dying in the tsunami certainly shaped the generosity.
There's a way in which this particular event felt closer to home in many different senses of that, but that's one of them, I guess.
It was on our doorstep, and the sense of vulnerability of people in Southeast Asia, those 7 countries and Australia, of actually your living coming from your sea, your recreation being by the ocean, your life being on the coastline, I think that really spoke to Australians.
Now, Tim, this was Christmas time, Christmas Boxing Day, and we're coming up to Christmas again. The world is not without strife and trouble and tragedy 20 years on from the tsunami. What does the hope of Christmas mean to you today?
Well, the tsunami has helped focus that up for me. I actually experienced God's strength, support, encouragement when I was responding. And Christmas is that God has not given up on this world, and in Jesus has actually suffered the very limitations of humanity, its frailty, its hopes, the best of humanity, and some of the things that are the worst of humanity, injustice. And for me, Christmas is a reminder I'm not abandoned, and God is present, and that hope at Christmas is actually what motivates my life.
Well, Tim, lovely to have you in. Pretty sobering topic, but I really appreciate your thoughts on it. Happy Christmas.
And to you, happy Christmas.
This is Life and Faith, and we've been speaking with Tim Costello about his experiences of the Asian tsunami when he was the CEO of World Vision Australia. So, the idea of peace on earth that we hear about at Christmas each year can begin to feel like a sad joke when faced with the turmoil of tsunamis and wars and hardship. So, what does it mean? What can it mean today for those experiencing anything but peace? Mark Stephens used to work here at CPX, and these days he is a New Testament lecturer at Sydney Missionary Bible College. And he's also an expert in the book of Revelation, the last book of the Bible. So we thought we'd get some help from Mark to understand this concept of peace on earth at Christmas time in light of the larger biblical story and the realities of the human experience. Mark Stephens, great to see you there. Thanks for being with us.
Good to be with you, Simon.
Now, Mark, are you a Christmas person? Do you love Christmas? Like I do. I love Christmas. Not everyone does.
Well, my wife is an insanely Christmas person, and she's slowly rubbing off on me. I'm a mildly Christmas person. My favourite Christmas movie is The Grinch.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I hope she's having an effect on you. It's been a while, so let's, she's taken some time.
It's getting there. I'm required to put the star on the tree every year. That's my special role.
Well, hopefully that gives you a bit of a boost. Now, there's a Christmas concept that we sing about and hear about. It's peace on earth. There's that famous line from Luke's gospel when at the birth of Jesus we have the angels declaring peace on earth and goodwill to people there. Wonder what that feels like to people when we're living in a time where it feels like anything but peace on earth. There's terrible wars going on, real polarization. That's not feeling very peaceful.
Yeah, the reality is that at any one time, I think people don't experience the world as being peaceful, but rather actually as kind of filled with evil and kind of how's this actually ever going to overturn and get resolved. And so that was certainly the experience of the first Christmas, and I think it remains the experience of many people's Christmas even in the present day.
Yeah, so what when we hear that line then at Christmas, what can it possibly mean to us in any kind of positive sense?
I think the sense we need to take on is, well, what can give us hope in the midst of a really dark period? So I guess the question is not simply, am I experiencing the world as peaceful in every part of my life? Because that's actually not true for most people in the world, and probably not true for anybody if we're really honest. But the question is there any reason for hope? And that's certainly what First Christmas is about. It's not about a pie in the sky vision. It's actually about, is there actually any hope and any reason for hope?
Yeah, and you mentioned that the birth of Jesus happens at a time. We have all these sort of sanitized depictions of this now, but it's itself not a peaceful experience there, is it? There's a lot going on.
Yeah, well, he's on the move. His family's on the move because a Roman emperor has decided to take a census. It's against the background of a military occupation of his land. Yeah, it's not a normal or easy time, and people are not simply just yearning for, a quiet family meal. They're actually yearning for a different political situation.
Yeah, so there's a sense of the story itself being full of drama and intrigue and kind of darkness, right?
Absolutely. And against the background of that, if you keep on reading in the story, I mean, even after Jesus is born, his life is threatened in the very early years of his life by a kind of half-Jewish king who's kind of insanely wanting to hold on to his power, and an experience of grief of people actually being killed because he wants to eliminate his political rivals. So it's not a nice story in many respects against that background.
Now, Mark, you're an expert in the book of Revelation.
Somewhat dubious honour, but yes, that's me.
Yeah. Is there anything from your material there that could help us understand this concept of peace on earth?
Yeah, well, the book of Revelation, it's an intense book filled with lots of pictures, and it pictures evil in a really graphic way. It pictures it like dragons and beasts, but that's actually where our feelings go when we think about evil. Evil's not mildly annoying, it's actually monstrous. But what's really fascinating about the book of Revelation is that in the middle of it, it pictures that God actually intervenes to overturn evil, but he intervenes by the birth of a baby. And you have this image of a dragon trying to attack the baby. That's the birth of Jesus. But instead of the dragon winning, the actual child born is the one who experiences the victory. And that clues us in that the reason for hope in the book of Revelation is the idea that a sacrificial act of vulnerability, a sacrificial act of weakness, is the means by which God will actually overturn evil and actually deal with the monsters in the world. And that's, I think, something that is a reason for hope, whether it's 2,000 years ago or in the present day.
Yeah, tell us a bit more about that, how that's depicted, the drama of all of that. Because it's pretty vivid, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. So there's kind of like an image of a woman giving birth and the dragon sitting over the woman, kind of ready to devour the baby. But instead of actually being able to consume him and devour him and destroy him, the baby is actually caught up and put on a throne. And ultimately, in the rest of the book, there's a whole bunch of pictures of ultimately the dragon and the beasts that threaten our lives is actually being dealt with in an act of justice that will slowly unfold because of what the baby has done. It's a turning point moment. So J.R. Tolkien, the great novelist, talked about, he wrote an essay called On Fairy Stories, which is like this attempt to try and explain why do we love fantasy literature. And he said one of the things is that fantasy literature portrays the turn. It portrays the moment when evil is actually dealt with. It's an amazing essay. You can look it up on the internet. But he said the birth of Christ is the good catastrophe. He called it the eucatastrophe, the turning point. And he said the birth of Christ is the eucatastrophe of human history. It's the turning point by which we know that the evil in this world can actually be dealt with.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's very cinematic, isn't it, this book? And you can sort of imagine it, I mean, in literature, but also you can imagine in a film version of this.
Yeah, and I think that's why we continue to love. I mean, you look at some of the films some of the only films these days which make money are those which can actually kind of portray these realities in these kind of fantastic visions because they actually map onto our experience more authentically. They tell us the truth about how good and evil works, but also how good will triumph over evil.
Is there a sort of sense when we sing about peace on earth, there's a longing attached to that, isn't there, that is situated within this dramatic story that you're talking about here?
Yeah, we know that it's not meant to be like this. And we know that the pictures and the stories that we create, they want to express not only the way the world is, but also the way the world should be. And the fact that we keep on producing pictures and stories that express this longing for the way the world should be, I think that's what something like the book of Revelation is tapping into, that we know we long for a moment of healing, but also a moment of justice.
And so for people this Christmas, Mark, who are in anything but peaceful situations, perhaps externally, but even inner peace that we all look for, is there a way that you'd say that this story can speak hope into their lives then? even in that situation.
Yeah, I think it does speak hope because in the first instance, it's a story that acknowledges the reality of our present experience. That our present experience isn't easy, and our present experience isn't sentimental, and our present experience doesn't look exactly like the finely painted Christmas card. So you can push beyond those sentimental images and actually go, Jesus was born into a world that was filled with pain and difficulty and suffering, but that same Jesus was actually able to fully engage that world, fully experience that world, and do something that can offer us genuine hope.
Yeah, it's a nice picture. And Mark, when you've got this Christmas, you'll have your star on the tree. You might have a moment of reflection here or there. Tell us about how that speaks to you as well. Like, what will that be like for you?
Yeah, I think because of the way Christmas sits together with New Year in our experience, I think it's always a chance to look back on the year and think about the disappointments and the pains, but also the sense of longing about what might be able to happen next year, what might be able to happen in the future, that this is not the end, that not everything is defined by my 2024. And that, I think, is one of the great joys about being able to come together at Christmas and to be able to latch on to a sense of hope for renewal.
This has been Life and Faith with me, Simon Smart. And this has been the final episode of Life and Faith for 2024. We've had a great time with you this year and loved bringing you all these really varied conversations. Thanks for your company. I hope you enjoyed it and found something to interest you and entertain you and stimulate your thinking. Thanks so much to my colleagues, Justine Toe and Max Jigannathan. And on behalf of them and our producer, Alan Douthwaite, we'd like to wish you a meaningful and restful Christmas and New Year. We'll be back in 2025 to continue the life and faith journey with you and hopefully your friends and people you can welcome into the life and faith world. We'll see you soon.